Welcome to the Daily History Podcast, where every day we dive into a fascinating chapter of our past. Today's episode, the Great Emu War, an unlikely battle in Australian history, promises a journey through one of the most bizarre conflicts ever. So buckle up as we travel back in time to the Australian outback of the 1930s. Picture the vast, sun-baked landscapes of Western Australia, a place where the red earth stretches far into the horizon. It's the early 1930s, and the world is still healing from the wounds of the First World War. Soldiers, who once bravely fought overseas, have returned to their homes, seeking solace in the quiet life of farming. But peace is short-lived for these veterans-turned-farmers, as a new adversary emerges, one that's feathered and fleet-footed: the emu. These flightless birds, native to the continent, are no strangers to the Australian bush. But in this historical chapter, they weren't innocuous wildlife. Instead, they morphed into an unforeseen menace to the livelihoods of the Western Australian farming community. Following a bountiful rainy season, thousands of emus began to move westward in a mass migration. Driven by an instinctual search for food and water, their arrival marked the beginning of an extraordinary saga of man versus bird. It's here, in the feather-lined trenches of the so-called Emu War, that our story takes a sharp turn into the absurd. The emus, in their search for sustenance, descended upon the wheat crops of the already struggling farmers. This sudden invasion led to widespread crop damage, and before long, the emu was cast as public enemy number one. Little did the farmers know that their battle against these unlikely foes would etch itself into history books as one of the most peculiar conflicts ever faced by humanity. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into what sparked off this bizarre battle and how it unfolded over the dusty fields of Australia's great southern land. As the heat bore down on the Australian landscape, a peculiar migration began to unfold across the arid outback. Legions of emus, the continent's flightless birds, embarked on an annual quest for sustenance. Driven by instinct and the relentless pursuit of food and water, these feathered foragers left their usual habitats in search of greener pastures. It was a seasonal trek, fueled by necessity. The vast flocks, some numbering in the thousands, surged toward the Western Australian wheat belt. The region, already grappling with the economic strains of the post-First World War era, had recently been blessed with a bountiful harvest. However, this prosperity soon turned to peril as the emus descended upon the farms. Their sheer numbers were overwhelming. They trampled crops, devoured harvests, and left a trail of destruction in their wake. Farmers watched in horror as their livelihoods came under siege by these avian invaders. The situation escalated as urgent calls for action were made. The beleaguered farmers implored the government for assistance, framing the conflict as one of survival, not just for themselves but for the nation's food supply. It all culminated in a most extraordinary decision: the deployment of the military to combat the emu incursion. The very idea seemed lifted from the pages of a far-fetched novel, yet it was a reality. The Australian Defence Force was about to wage what would be derisively dubbed the Great Emu War. The stage was set not merely for a clash between farmers and fauna, but for an event that would etch itself into the annals of history as one of the most unusual and unforgettable episodes of man versus nature. As the early 1930s sun scorched the vast Western Australian landscape, the soldiers stationed there would begin what is now known as the initial maneuvers of the Great Emu War. Initially, you might imagine a conventional battlefield scenario. However, the adversaries here were not armed militants, but an army of emus foraging for food and water in the wake of their breeding season. The military operations commenced in November of 1932 under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. His unit, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, embarked on a mission they believed would be a swift and decisive victory. The reality, as they would soon discover, was remarkably different. What the military hadn't anticipated was the emu's remarkable agility and resilience. These large, flightless birds could sprint at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour. Their zigzagging escape maneuvers confounded the soldiers' efforts to target them. Tails of the birds, absorbing multiple bullets and continuing their rapid dash across the terrain, became a source of astonishment and frustration among the troops. Major Meredith's diary entries reveal a tone of restrained incredulity at the bird's capacities to evade capture and harm. One report describes an incident where a single emu was allegedly hit by a number of bullets but continued to flee, effectively eluding its human pursuers. This persistence and tenacity of the emus led the soldiers into a grudging respect for their feathered foes. Anecdotes such as these swiftly colored the narrative of the conflict. It wasn't long before even the soldiers themselves began to question the effectiveness of their campaign. They were to realize, while their military training prepared them for human opposition, outwitting these avian adversaries was an entirely uncharted domain. While the battle against the emus continued, the key figures like Major Meredith and his men were drawn deeper into a conflict that was quickly becoming more farcical than fearsome. This chapter in the annals of military history was fast approaching its climax. Little did those involved realize it was a climax that would echo in the halls of history for its sheer improbability and irony. As the conflict between emus and farmers escalated, the Australian media soon picked up on what was fast becoming a novel spectacle in the year 1932. Newspapers across the country, and even internationally, began to report on the unusual military campaign, with a mixture of intrigue and bemusement. In the articles of the time, the emus were often portrayed as the unexpected victors in a battle against a well-equipped adversary, the Australian soldiers. The tone ranged from sarcastic to outright critical, with some journalists questioning the government's decision to use military resources to deal with a wildlife problem. Reports highlighted the emu's uncanny ability to evade gunfire and the military's ensuing struggles, inadvertently painting the birds almost as guileful combatants in this unforeseen theater of war. Public opinion was divided. While some found a sense of humor in the situation, many farmers in the affected areas were certainly not laughing. They dealt with the destruction of their crops and livelihoods and therefore largely supported the government's intervention. On the flip side, city dwellers and those further removed from the situation were more likely to see the war as an absurdity or even as fodder for jokes and cartoons. Politicians, too, were split on the matter. Some defended the necessity of the operation, arguing the dire economic circumstances of the farmers post-World War I required unusual measures. Others, however, saw it as a misuse of military resources and a source of national embarrassment, especially as stories of the war traveled and gained prominence overseas. Amidst mounting public scrutiny and continued media mockery, the military leaders on the ground began to adapt their strategies. Attempts were made to organize more coordinated drives, with soldiers attempting to herd the emus into an ambush. However, even these revised tactics had limited success against the surprisingly savvy birds. Eventually, as the operation drew more ridicule than results and the expenditure was weighed against the lackluster outcomes, the military's involvement was withdrawn. By mid-November 1932, the government had decided to cease the military operation, marking the end of a peculiar and largely futile effort to control the emu population through force. This decision led to the end of what many considered to be one of the oddest conflicts in Australia's and perhaps the world's history. Following the cessation of military attempts to manage the emu population, Western Australia's farmers were left with fields littered with bullets rather than bird carcasses. The Great Emu War had concluded, but for the defenders of agricultural prosperity, the silence of defeat was palpable. The emus, largely unscathed by the efforts of machine guns, continued to graze and traverse the expansive farmlands that they had claimed as their own. This failed campaign raised critical questions about the relationship between humanity and the environment, signaling a need for more sustainable management practices. In the years that followed, it became evident that the conflict had deeper roots than just the emu's destruction of crops. It highlighted the vulnerability of agricultural systems to the unpredictable forces of nature and served as a catalyst for change in agricultural policies. While farmers recuperated from economic setbacks, emu populations, now recognized as part and parcel of the Australian outback, continued to thrive. They had become symbols of the nation's unique wildlife and the challenges of life on the land. Conservation efforts eventually swung in the other direction, aiming to ensure that these resilient birds would not face extinction due to human actions. As for cultural legacy, the Great Emu War took its rightful place in the annals of Australian history as a story imbued with both head-shaking disbelief and a tinge of amusement. It serves as a conversation starter about humankind's occasional overconfidence in the face of nature's will. The incident has been commemorated in literature, documentaries, and even referenced in political discourse as an example of an unorthodox problem that demanded an equally unorthodox solution, which in the end proved to be a misadventure. Today, the Great Emu War is a testament to the power of emus, the tenacity of farmers, and the unpredictable journey of history. As we near the end of our episode on the Great Emu War, it's important to pause and reflect on the lessons ingrained within this slice of history. It's a moment to acknowledge that even the best strategies can unravel in the most unexpected manner. Think about it. The military might of humans, equipped with advanced weaponry, outsmarted by flightless birds. It's a scenario that, on paper, should have had a very different outcome. And yet the emu's unpredictable behavior turned the tables, reminding us that nature has a way of defying human attempts to control it and pointing to the larger unpredictability of life itself. This brings us to a delicate balance, the intersection where humor meets gravity. On one hand, we have the almost slapstick image of soldiers versus emus. On the other, the real consequences for farmers struggling to protect their livelihoods. It's this contrast that cements the Great Emu War in our collective memory, a peculiar chapter where the line between comedy and severity was as blurred as the battlefield became for those involved. That brings us to the end of today's quirky dive into history. If you enjoyed this episode of the Daily History Podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Do you have a piece of peculiar history you want us to explore next? Drop a comment below, and the suggestion with the most likes will be front and center in an upcoming episode. Thank you for listening, and always remember, history is often stranger than fiction. Until next time.